think that the main society is the enemy and they would be willing to join the cause of the Islamists. So that was a strategy paper in 2011, and if we look at the situation today, we might come to the conclusion they are on the road to succeed. Because, as you know, the violence is on the rise from the Islamist side, but also the violence is on the rise from the right-wing extremist side. And the most extreme case probably was the 2011 attack of Anders Breivik in Norway. You might remember that, when 77 people were killed, because he thought he would have a duty to defend the Christian Europe against all Muslims and against Islam. And you might have heard that there was a case just briefly here in Germany recently that several officers of the German army actually probably conspired to commit a terrorist attack within Germany from a right-wing extremist point of view, and they wanted to make it look like as if it was committed by Muslims within Germany, or migrants, Muslim migrants within Germany. So you see this polarization, and I think, therefore, there might be a conclusion that 15 years after 9/11, we are focused too much on military intelligence and police work. Don't get me wrong, I think this is important too, but there are two other things important, and we're going to talk about this now. One is the fight against the ideologies, no matter whether they are on the Islamist or on the right-wing extremist, on the left-wing extremist side, because they are the justification for violence. And number two, how to take away the fertile ground, because there are young people across Europe who are joining into the causes on either side of the scale. So we're going to talk about de-radicalization and prevention. And there are three people here on the panel who are really the best experienced to talk about it. And first I would welcome Roberta Bonazzi. She is actually the director of the European, or president of the European Foundation for Democracy, which is seated in Brussels. And the European Foundation for Democracy is also sponsoring this panel. So thank you very much for Roberta for doing that and being here. And she has a lot of expertise on violent radicalization, foreign relations, democratic reform, and extremism. And I will ask her to elaborate on that a little bit in a few seconds. I'd also like to welcome Tamina Kazi, who is with Cork Equal and Sustainable Communities Alliance in Cork. But she also was director of the charity British Muslims for Secular Democracy from May 2009 to August 2016, where she worked to raise awareness of secularism among British Muslims and the wider public. Welcome. And also Andreas Sugar, who joins us from Denmark, from Copenhagen. Andreas has a long experience in UN, United Nations peacekeeping missions, I read. Very impressive. And now he is working for the International Media Support Organization, and he will tell us in a minute what it actually does. But I'd like to start with Roberta. Roberta, please tell us a little bit about your approach towards the issue of countering violent extremism.
Thank you, Elmar. And a special thank you also to IPI. For us, it was actually an interesting opportunity to be able to share and contribute to this panel, because for the past 12, nearly 13 years, based in Brussels, we've been working and trying to support and give visibility to alternative voices. Alternative voices when it comes to the issues of radicalization. And being able to organize or to be part of this panel was also the opportunity to engage with journalists, representatives from the media, who, when it comes to efforts to support and give visibility to powerful alternative voices, can play a very important role. just to go back to the work we do, from the beginning of our activities, our goal was to address and contribute to the overall debate on terrorism by bringing more informed voices. Polarization on the debate was very strong and very present already 10, 15 years ago, ever since, I would say, 9/11. Today, we still have a very polarized society, even if with different models. As Elmar said, counter-terrorism strategies cannot be based or function through security measures alone. Police security are an important component when it comes to counter-terrorism, but it is evidence more than ever today that by themselves they cannot contribute to preventing radicalization. And when we talk about preventing radicalization, it is clear that governments, institutional players like intelligence communities, law enforcement, need to engage and support civil society actors. The big question is, who are these civil society actors? How to support them? How to empower them? And how to ensure that, for instance, stakeholders and important players of society like the media are able to access these alternative voices. Let me clarify also what alternative means. Alternative voices are actually the voices of very normal individuals. Individuals with migrant, Muslim background, but individuals who are so much part of our societies that policymakers, the media, and many other players tend to ignore them. So for us, the question and what we've been trying to address is how these individuals can have a platform, how can they have visibility, how can we prevent or ensure that visibility and the spotlight is not given only to those groups, organizations, individuals who actually support violent ideologies, even if sometimes in a more hidden way, not necessarily visible. Very often, what we've experienced is that, the question that actually I have as we continue in this conversation that I have, or my colleagues and I have when it comes to interacting with the media is what can make these normal voices relevant to the media? How can we provide the expertise, the knowledge, and the insight that well-integrated people within communities, within our societies can have, and who are actually the first not only to see and recognize the signs of radicalizations within their own communities, but who have feared these ideologies long before than we even saw them. And we'll hear from Tamina, but already 10 years ago when we launched one of our first empowerment programs with individuals and organizations from 7 European countries actually, with a Muslim and immigrant background, they were the first ones who were coming to us saying, we know exactly what is going on. We know these preachers or these organizations, we know what they're trying to do and how they're promoting a narrative that is in total contradiction with the values of open societies. And yet nobody else wanted to listen to them. It was very difficult to bring these individuals to policymakers or to the media. And somehow, maybe someone can answer these questions. Somehow there's more interest in bearded guys.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that one. How hard is it actually? You just said they came to you, so they volunteered to actually, they wanted to be heard. Is it also sometimes hard to find people who who want to have a voice because they are reluctant to stick out in society, to be recognized and maybe then come under pressure for some reasons?
It is very hard because they're not organized. They're often individuals or organizations set up by individuals. Individuals who by their own nature are liberal-minded, and whoever is liberal-minded actually is very independent. They're not driven by any ideology, whether it's a religious-based ideology or a political-based ideology. Marxist ideology was very powerful in bringing together people and instilling in a group a very strong discipline. This is what I would say, one of the most difficult, challenging, and frustrating experience trying to bring this individual together.
Let's play this ball to Tamina, because Tamina, when you worked for the British Muslims for Secular Democracy, I imagine that after the attacks in 2005 in Great Britain, in London actually, probably there was a polarization within society as well. How hard was it to actually get a voice and give a voice to people who said, well, we have to do more as Muslims within society to counter that kind of radical idea that is behind what happened in 2005?
Well, British Muslims for Secular Democracy was born in 2009, and it was the result of the collaboration between Yasmin Alabai-Brown, who's a journalist for The Independent, and Nasreen Rehman, who was on the Commission for British Muslims and Islamophobia. And it came about because they really felt that there was a space for a liberal, secular Muslim voice that wasn't being represented by the other Muslim organizations in the UK. We felt that a lot of the existing Muslim organizations were putting forward a very separatist vision of what it means to be Muslim in the UK, and wanted to make special demands on behalf of Muslims and seeing them as a monolithic bloc rather than recognizing their differences, and the fact that several of us want to put forward a sort of a secular perspective. We don't want special demands. We don't want to be seen as a monolithic bloc. And it was quite difficult actually putting the organization together and getting people an effective board of trustees, because a lot of people didn't want to sort of publicly associate with a sort of a secular Muslim movement. They were afraid of the sort of personal ramifications for themselves, the backlash for them professionally as well. So it was very difficult to begin with. And then, for example, when I would go out and give talks in community centres and schools and universities, sometimes you'd get asked things like, how is it possible to be Muslim and secular at the same time? So this was one of the early barriers that I faced. But I found that over the years, fewer and fewer people were asking that question. So I really felt that we made a really significant contribution in terms of popularizing a secular Muslim identity, one that's totally comfortable with modern equality and human rights standards. And hopefully that work will continue.
Possibly you personally were under pressure as well during that time. Can you tell us a little bit about this experience? Have there been Muslims who said, well, there is nothing like secular Islam or something like this? Or also pressure from the other side, right-wing extremists who might say, well, you're just posing as a secular Muslim, but you're not?
Yes, in fact, there was quite a trenchant example of that in 2009 when British Muslims for Secular Democracy co-organized a protest against the English Defence League, who were protesting outside Harrow Mosque, which also happened to be my local mosque at the time. And as a result of getting involved in this protest and helping to organize it, I received comments from Stephen Gash, who was the leader of an organization called Stop the Islamification of Europe. And he said there's no such thing as a secular Muslim. A secular Muslim is practicing taqiyya, basically is a liar. So you get accusations from both sides. You get from the far right and also from Islamist and conservative Muslims who say that you're simply not Muslim enough.
Let me follow up with a question to both of you, Roberta and Tamina. How is it possible to create an atmosphere where actually it is possible to talk about totally different views about something, because probably it's not just enough to empower alternative voices who just have their point of view, but also to have a discussion, to facilitate a discussion or an argument even about important things within the society. Tamina or Roberta?
That's a difficult question. I think the question relates to the essence of democracy with everything that it carries, and that is respect of different views, respect of minorities, respect of or accepting the views of others. Now, when it comes, and I support this completely, so when it comes to giving a platform and supporting different views, my instinct is that my or our responsibility is to support as much as possible all those groups and individuals who do not deny the principles and the values and the structures of open societies and liberal democracies. I do hesitate, and actually I'm totally against giving a platform to groups, ideologically based groups that advocate for the destruction of such institutions. And this applies to any ideology, whether it's an extreme right wing, and in Germany there's a very, very strong sensitivity when it comes to neo-Nazi views. There's no doubt what this ideology means. But Germany is probably the only country in Europe that has gone through this very deep and painful work and exercise to re-understand and condemn the ideology. No other country in Europe who was involved in the run-up to the Second World War in supporting or the same ideologies has gone through the same exercise. So what you have is that extremist right-wing ideologies are often more tolerated outside of Germany. I believe that none of these ideologies should have an open platform, whether they're Islamist ideologies or right-wing.
So there has to be a basic consensus, a basic understanding of what at least this basis is in order to be able to discuss openly with each other the things.
There has to be much more clarity on what these ideologies are and how they function. If we move the question to the more practical area of prevention of radicalization, empowering civil society organizations, there's been discussion both in Germany and across Europe on whether, for instance, Salafist groups could play a role in like distancing individuals from violence. Could they play a role not so much in de-radicalization, but in preventing any form of violence? For me, the next question, or the parallel question to this one, is could we work with neo-Nazi groups to educate young children?
And we have to come back to that issue, but I want to bring Andreas actually, into the discussion as well, because with your experience, how hard it is, because international media support, as I understand it, is working mostly outside of, or only outside of Denmark. So what are your experiences in supporting media initiatives or journalists actually to get the to get basically the alternative voices to be part of the discussion within a society around the world?
Well, I think radicalization thrives in societies and countries where there's oppression, where there's no access to free media, lack of freedom of assembly, where you have either very weak institutions or too strong institutions or regimes. And of course, in such places, the role of media is very important, or supporting media is very important, because media plays different roles. First of all, is the role of media to hold leaders accountable, to challenge decision makers, to expose corruption, inequality, other issues. If you don't have that space, if people feel that their grievances are not heard, then radicalization is much easier. So the media both plays that role of actively challenging and holding to account, but also even just providing a forum for debate, platforms for dialogue. So those are important, very important.
And your organization is involved in actually creating those forums or actually enabling people to participate. You are responsible for it's called the rapid response for the international media support. What are you doing there?
Well, first of all, international media support works globally. We have programs in, at the moment, I think 40 to 50 countries around the world. Most of those programs are longer term in nature because developing and supporting media and have them go through various stages and become more professional takes time. But then we also have a mechanism, a rapid response mechanism that allows us to move in short term, but on short notice, in countries that are either going through conflict or are facing some kind of emergency or sudden political change in political context.
Can you give us a recent example where you actually work?
I mean, and also just to say the political transition can be positive or negative. It could be something going for the worse, that, for instance, as we've seen in Turkey over a number of years, but especially since the coup attempt last year, the space for media and journalists has been even further restricted. So we are trying to work with a few independent media outlets there. But then another recent example is the Gambia, that after 22 years got rid of a dictator, and basically there's a whole generation of journalists that are not, that have basically just been microphone holders for the president and his ministers for more than 20 years. They have to be educated. They have to understand what the role of media is in a free society. So that's almost the opposite example of Turkey. We also have been supporting some media groups in Colombia after the peace agreement was signed last year.
So would that be a good example where we can see that actually having an outlet, having a voice, being part of the dialogue within society helps with regards to stabilizing a society and getting rid of radical views as well, as we have seen in Colombia?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in Colombia, it's also a matter of the media very much covering events from a conflict point of view. So basically understanding peace, understanding what society will be going through now in the coming months and years takes you need a new perspective for that. So helping journalists get to that point, enabling them to cover events in their country from that point of view is something that we can help with from the outside.
And now you would think, Tamina, that in an open and free society as Great Britain, you would think there must be media outlets who are giving the alternative voices some kind of platform, but it's hard, you said to me.
I found that over the years, liberal media platforms like The Guardian and increasingly The Independent have stopped giving platforms to liberal, secular and reformist Muslim voices. So for example, the Guardian's Comment is Free section, they would take comment pieces from BMSD until about 2012, and then they just stopped because they realized that we wouldn't parrot their line about Muslims always being the victims and never the perpetrators of any offense. So since then I've written and put pieces for blogs such as Open Democracy, and then other forums that were set up specifically by progressive individuals of Muslim background to amplify our voices, the voices that don't really get heard in the mainstream media. And even at the Independent, they used to have Yasmin Alibhai-Brown as a columnist, and of course she's the co-founder of British Muslims for Secular Democracy. But when they went online, she unfortunately was made redundant, and they lost a really good balanced voice there, because Yasmin was very vocal and very critical of Islamism and religious fundamentalism, but at the same time she would shine a spotlight on anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Muslim abuse. So I think I really wish that the liberal press would come out more in favor of these kinds of voices.
Do I understand correctly that the Guardian might have been doing this just mostly for political reasons, being a liberal voice, but are there other media outlets who do that also just because they want to have the controversy, the most extreme views and nothing in between, in order to maybe even get a higher market share or a higher rating number?
Yeah, I mean, especially now as most of the readership has gone digital, there are plenty of what I would term clickbaity articles on Muslim issues that are what I would say is devoid of any real nuance and understanding. And again, it's all about sensationalism and getting the highest number of clicks and views, and not about any kind of real understanding or considered examination of the issues. And that's exactly why organizations like CIDA and Sisterhood and Double Bind magazine have been set up. And CIDA was set up by a British journalist named Iram Ramzan, who herself is a progressive from a Muslim background, and she wanted to empower like-minded people and give them the opportunity to get opinion pieces out there in public. And the website's doing really well. They're having a crowdfunding campaign at the moment. And then Double Bind magazine that I mentioned before, that was set up by the Norwegian film producer Dia Khan, and sorry, Sisterhood, isn't it? Yeah, Sisterhood, yeah. Double Bind was set up by Shaheen Hashmat, sorry. So these three organizations have all been set up by Muslim women, women of Muslim background, who consider themselves to be progressives. And I'm really happy to see these kinds of initiatives.
And Roberta, you said you are supporting these kinds of initiatives. How do you actually pick them? How do you get to know what they are doing, how big of an impact they would have? And also, if you could address the question, how important, you mentioned that before, is it to start very early with kids at school, really very young people, because they might be prone to fall into the trap of radicalization?
On the first question, and building on what Tamina was saying, on one hand, I think we can find on one hand media outlets or specific media outlets that share or do not share the views of certain groups, so they make a positive decision of not including certain voices. Overall, what we've also seen is that it's difficult for the media to find this voice. It's difficult for us. It's difficult for society, but it's certainly difficult for the media to find specific expertise or different voices. And it's difficult for these individuals and groups to get together and obtain this visibility. So what you have in the overall debate, in the public debate, is generally the large institutionalized groups. Think of Germany as, I don't make names, but there's DTIP is one
of the biggest Muslim groups,
in every European countries. You have the like bodies that have been set up over the past 15-20 years, claiming to represent all Muslims of not communities, Muslims of certain countries. Somehow these groups have managed to position themselves as the only interlocutor of decision makers and of the government, and inevitably have also become the go-to kind of source of information for the media, because it's not easy to find individual voices. Now, when it comes to how we try to work, the main challenge is really to go and connect with these individuals, to find them, to address their needs, to listen to what they have to say, and to listen to their strengths and weaknesses. For instance, in 2009, 2010, we launched this project to empower alternative voices. And it's ironic because that was long before there was this overall discussion about building resilience within communities or vulnerable communities by empowering voices. And what we did was literally work on a national level in 7, 8 European countries through a whole network of contacts to identify individuals, groups, help them setting up their own coalition or their own initiatives. It's not easy precisely because they don't have a voice, they don't have a platform, they don't know how to reach public audiences, you don't see them. And it requires an effort that too often policymakers and the media don't make. So it's much easier to go to the ones we already know. What we did was literally using our network of contacts and then build on it from one, and there's people that come in and out. But some of the work that we tried to do was training, connection, helping them network. Some of them have become incredibly empowered, as in incredibly visible or incredibly effective in their activities. Tamina was part of these efforts back then, and certainly she was already like a rising star before we even arrived. But in many cases, it certainly was a very important learning process. There are things we would do differently, and we were naive back then when we thought, well, we just bring them together. They will all understand what we mean, and they will all automatically work together, because the mistake we made was they're of Muslim background and they totally understand what we're saying. In fact, they're not. They're so totally integrated that they were Germans, Italians, French, Swedish, and for us that was a bit of a reality check. We were not bringing together just Muslims, if we want to call them, but citizens from Germany, from France, from Italy, of migrant or Muslim heritage, but who had exactly the same, represented in a way the same stereotypes that you would have for any of these nationalities. So I let you imagine what happened with the Italian participants. They all disappeared.
Was a very fruitful discussion, I guess. Tamina, how important is it to address young people very early? Because some of the grievances that might create fertile ground for radicalization are actually starting very early as well. If you have a worse chance of a good education, if you have a worse chance to actually get a good job, that can create those kinds of grievances, I guess.
One of the first projects that we put together at British Muslims for Secular Democracy was the Young Muslim Leadership Network. And we did this in collaboration with the Citizenship Foundation. And we got together groups of young British Muslims aged from 16 to 21 and got them to think about issues that affect them and how to present these in creative ways to policymakers. And it was a very successful project. My group, for example, decided to make a short film about the headscarf and how to deconstruct stereotypes surrounding women who wear it. And what was really powerful about this film was that it not only included the voices of women who currently wore the headscarf and had very positive feelings about it, but also a woman who used to wear a headscarf and then decided to take it off, which is a voice that we don't really hear much of in the mainstream public debate. And we were able to put these voices forward, and it'd be really good to see more projects like that explore issues that are close to the hearts of young Muslims in creative ways, and promote civic engagement among Muslims, as well as countering extreme narratives all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, before I open for questions, just one more question to Andreas. Andreas, when you support media around the world, in many of those countries there is actually a very young population. It is the young people who are willing to engage, and we have seen a whole revolution, the Arab Revolution actually, where it was the young people who actually rose up in order to change things. How do you see that? How can you support with your work specifically media that are driven by young journalists and giving young people their point of view?
I mean, of course, we are looking, anywhere we operate, we're looking for who are the right partners in a given context. And you're very right, in many places where we work, young population, first of all, is a big part of the population. And secondly, those are the ones that you want to reach often. So we do support youth media, different youth groups, but also trying to have media focus on issues that concern young people, unemployment, corrupt leaders, other things that are of concern to them.
And do you specifically seek those young people out in order to support them when they want to create a newspaper or whatever?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, not only, but that will also be part of it. Absolutely.
Well, I want to open it for the discussion, please. And please state your name and your affiliation.
Okay.
If that's possible.
Humayra Bakhtiar, journalist from Tajikistan. I have one question because last time, in my view, some ruling mass media or even local mass media using in unplace about Muslim and Islam. For example, I can remember from Independent, CO UK, and also one Japanese ruling mass media. They wrote one article about Muslim prostitute in Bangladesh. But there wasn't any analysis about what kind of rights they have in Bangladesh, social issues, medical insurance, no anything. Just they put Muslim prostitutes, but we know that the prostitutes is everywhere. But these kind of topics can auditory to be more negative or anti-Islam, and even can do radical between the auditory. My question is that could we stop or invite some mass media in the world to stop sometimes use the word Muslim, Islam, or even any religion, because we know every people can be good or bad. It's not depends on from the religion why we should use this name or the other religion. This is isn't time to invite them to stop in and to make a more tolerance auditory? Thank you.
Roberta, turn it to you.
The first thought is that I guess it depends very much on what the topic of the article or the coverage is. If we're talking about radicalization in general that is inspired on an ideology, and I'm not talking about religion, then the reference has to be there. If it's, I agree with you. What is the meaning of Muslim prostitutions? I guess then there can be a whole range of a whole analysis of. It depends on. I agree with you in the sense that sometimes religion is just used to frame or label a particular topic. When it comes to specifically the work or the news coverage relating to a terrorist attack or a radicalization process that is based, justified, or inspired by an ideological use of religion, well, we cannot ignore that it's there.
Mm-hmm. Andreas?
I absolutely agree that I guess that was also part of your point, that the media contribute to polarization and to creating stereotypes, and that's a huge problem. And it's linked to what Timina was saying, that media are chasing clicks, and that's very unfortunate. There's also, media tend to, I think, focus far too much on terrorist acts and much less on the root causes. So just, it struck me, was it yesterday or the day before this incident in Times Square, that very quickly, after 20, 30 minutes, it turned out it wasn't a terrorist attack, but because it just had that whiff of possible terrorism, it carried the news of the day. So there's so much focus on terrorist acts, on not on the root causes. In Danish media, for instance, there's a lot of focus when you talk about immigrant youth. You would think that all of them are gang members. There's very little talk about the ones who are actually successful in culture and politics and many other areas. So the media play a huge role and have a responsibility that I think is not being addressed properly.
Tamina, you want to address that also?
Yes, there was a case of a Muslim journalist, a visibly Muslim journalist named Fatima Manji, who was reporting on the, I think it was the truck attack in Nice, and then Kelvin Mackenzie wrote in The Sun, where he basically questioned what a visibly Muslim woman was doing, reporting on such a case. And then I think she successfully used the IPSO code in order to protest that protest against that coverage, and I believe she was successful as well. So we can use sort of media and broadcasting codes in order to protest against and to question and to highlight that kind of biased coverage.
In Germany, interesting enough, hopefully, is we have a code of conduct for the press, and it actually says that we should not mention either an ethnic or religious or other affiliation if it's not really necessary for the understanding of the story. So we would leave that out. That was it is basically a self-restriction by German media. But over the past 3 years now, there has been a huge discussion about that because we had the events within Germany with regards to, for example, you might have heard about New Year's Eve events in Cologne, where young people attacked women. And there was a big discussion whether we should have or should not have said that most of them were migrants or asylum seekers or from Muslim countries or from North African countries. So this restriction is under attack right now, but it hasn't been resolved yet, this question.
One short
Follow?
reply. I'm sorry, short
yeah.
reply in these issues. Because I have seen many articles, I have searched, and I didn't find any good analysis that how many percent of Muslim is in the world are radical or terrorist. Mm-hmm. But when we are writing, we are journalists writing, we will just remind Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism. And in my view, it's making auditory more negative. And why, when we haven't any analysis in our hands, for example, we don't know how many percent are radical or terrorists, maybe 0.0% one. So it's not all the Muslim or all the Islam. But what you're saying, it's not time to stop it and to make more strong analysis about it.
I think we all can understand that, but at the same time, and Roberta pointed that out, if somebody is committing an atrocity and is misusing a religion for that, and we call that Islamism, and there is Christian fundamentalism as well that actually can contribute to something like that. Anders Breivik is an example in Norway, then we have to mention it. But there are many incidents, as you said, where we shouldn't use it, in my view as well. Please.
Daoud Kutab. We've been discussing mostly a Eurocentric point of view, and I'd like to give a kind of a global, or at least a Middle Eastern point of view, because the issue of Islam is not the big problem, because almost everybody is Muslim, but the issue of radicalism is a problem. And media is responsible for two different things in the issue of radicalism. On the one hand, media is not available to most people, and therefore we've been doing a lot of research, and radicalism, there's no one source of radicalism. Some do it for financial reasons, some do it for political reasons because they don't feel empowered, some do it because they are upset with their particular government, and so on and so forth. So the fact that they don't have the access to media is one of the reasons why people turn to radicalism. And the second is how people in the radical movement use media, and what can media do to kind of respond to that. And my organization has been doing a lot of work in area what we call enlightenment. Instead of fighting the kind of the radicalism, we like to kind of encourage more openness, enlightenment, and respect for others, and so on. And we've done a lot of research with young people because we do a lot of focus groups to find out what is it that makes them angry and what can we do. And we realized that once people reach a particular point of view, it's a waste of time to try to change them. Basically, it's the security that can do that. But it's when they are at that edge, when they're kind of about to become radicalized, is really the time when we have to try to reach them and approach them, through their families, through their friends, through their colleagues. And we've done a lot of research in that area. We've done a lot of public service announcements, radio and video, that we're distributing. They're available for free for anybody who wants to use them in Arabic. And of course, there's some subtitles to English. But the idea is some of the messages that we're working on is a message of hypocrisy, the message of that you can, that joining these groups is not the solution and so on. And we've been doing a lot of testing with this. And it's really important the way the testing results, because we have found that sometimes when you're trying to counter some of these violent groups, you're actually endorsing them. Mm-hmm. Because if you show something in a negative way, some people actually buy that in, rather. So as a journalist or as media people, you have to be very careful not to, as an example, if you want to show an ad against smoking, you don't show somebody smoking because it might encourage more smoking. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very tiny, thin line between when you're trying to prevent people going to this, that you're actually giving them more intellectual weapons to continue in that direction.
Let me pass
it's
that
quite
ball.
Scary.
Let me pass that ball to the panel who wants to address it.
You touched on to the gentleman. You touched on the key difficulty that anyone engaged on prevention of radicalization is dealing. One is how to develop a narrative, an alternative narrative, how to have an impact, how to prioritize, identify and prioritize the target audiences, and who are the best communicators. And this is something that you're right, the conversation until now was very Eurocentric, but the work that we're doing, for instance, is in cooperation with many groups, organizations, or individuals from the region, from the Middle East, North Africa to Jordan and so on, and they're facing the same challenge. And what you'll see is that, I'm sure you've noticed, is also that, well, first, the root causes is actually one of the most difficult area to define, because, as you said, there are so many different reasons. Probably the only recurring element is that, well, first, that there is not one single cause at the root of radicalization or terrorism. But there are as many individuals who join, and the only recurring element is actually the ideology that is at the base of justifications that are used by different groups or individuals to recruit or reinforce the real or perceived grievances of individuals. And when it comes to communicate with these groups, the big challenge is who's the best messengers. Governments have a role to play, but maybe their narrative is not able to impact and change the mind of some young kids or whatever. So that's the challenge, is to work and empower those groups within civil society who can reach the different audiences, whether it's young people, women, or and so on.
Is it important to keep a distance from the governments, because governments are perceived to be not credible because they have their point of view?
It is, certainly. It goes back to who's the credible one. So even if you are potentially a good ambassador to connect and engage with young people, maybe if you go there with the label or the hat of a program funded by any authorities, whether it's the central government or the police, that's how you're seen. So it's about being clever, about thinking really who needs to be influenced, and just using the brain, which is not always used, by the way.
in the back first, and then right in front of.
Hello, Louis Sanders, Deutsche Welle. The othering of Muslims, especially in Western Europe, has been happening for decades, if not centuries. This is something that Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar, has written extensively about. And I would like to know, from your perspectives, directly engaging in these issues, what are things that news outlets, legacy players, the publishing industry can do, practical steps to kind of combat or tackle these challenges that you're all talking about?
Second question as well. Colleague right in front, yeah.
Hi, I'm Anita from the Week magazine, India. I also live in Norway, so I'm kind of in two continents. I have a comment and a question for Temina. The comment is that I'm part of an organization that is headquartered in Vienna, and we run something called the Mothers Schools in Indonesia, in Kashmir and Brussels, where we have identified the fact that it is adolescent boys that are most likely to be radicalized, and what the gentleman said earlier, that when it's too far gone, it's difficult. So the best prevention is at that age. And the idea of these schools is just to have mothers, train the mothers to spot what are some of the kind of behavioral changes that they can see in their adolescent boys that can suggest that they are getting radicalized. And it could be, small things like suddenly going more and more quiet and getting more and more online on the internet. And so mothers act as the early warning system, signals. And then the thing is, once the mothers identify this, it's not that they run to the police, because these are vulnerable communities. These are migrant communities who face a lot of ghettoization. So the idea is that there are counselors that they can go to, that they feel safe, so that they know how to handle the boys without driving them further into this. So that's something, but like you doing all kinds of efforts, like your youth leadership program, the problem that, of course, we also face is that it's like the dam has burst, and what we are trying to do is to try and stop the leak with just one finger. What we're doing is so little, so we feel that frustration. My question to you, Temina, is that what you're doing, the secular voices that you are giving a platform to, the best way to counter radical Islam as a journalist, I feel, is to give to have the secular voices more visible, more vocal. Are you having these networks around the world in different cities, in different countries, so that you could be a big platform worldwide, not just in Britain?
Who wants to address both questions? Tamina first.
Well, I found that the European Foundation for Democracy's network was an excellent way of meeting other activists around Europe back in 2010, and we've expanded on that since, mainly with the help of social media. So we've been able to connect with activists and journalists around the world who work on promoting secularism and challenging extremist narratives. And we've really used Facebook very heavily to that end, and also the platforms that I mentioned before, like CEDA and Double Bind magazine. CEDA in particular have been very good at always commenting on hot button issues affecting Muslims. Even things like the European Court of Justice ruling on religious symbols, for example. I think they were one of the first alternative media platforms to put out different perspectives on that.
Andreas?
Yep, answering the gentleman's question about what the media can do. I think, as I also said earlier, I think the media should do much more to address and cover root causes, and also to look at the nuances, because it's so black and white often, this debate. I'm surprised about, for instance, talking to educated people in Denmark, what a simplistic and one-sided view they have of Islam. It's a religion that counts over 1 billion people, and you have the whole spectrum of Muslims, from extremists to completely secular and everything in between. And I've yet to see Danish newspaper run a campaign about an ABC on Islam or something like that, or challenging politicians who also often fall into the trap of stereotypes and so on. An example, for instance, when I think it was after the Charlie Hebdo incident in Paris a couple of years ago, there was sort of panel of all the party leaders in Denmark that same night, and they all, I was just so surprised about how simplistic it was. It was all, well, they hate our freedoms, and there was, I mean, there it would clearly be the role of the journalists and media to go after the politicians, try and have them debate the nuances, the root causes. What can we do? Do we also carry part of the responsibility as a society, as politicians, and so on? And that I really would like to see much more of.
Last question up here.
Andreas, you mentioned. Sorry. Robert von Lucius, formerly Africa correspondent, Frankfurt Allgemeine. Andreas, you mentioned the example of Gambia, where you had the task of educating, training a whole generation of journalists that were deprived of, under authoritarian government, of real journalism. How do you approach that? What's your task? What are your experience? Can one learn from that for other countries and societies? Thanks.
Sure. I mean, since we're doing it as part of our rapid response mechanism, it's for the time being at least, it's bound to be short term. So usually our rapid response interventions are between 6 to 12 months, and obviously we can't change everything or help change media and journalism in the Gambia during that period. So at least we've visited the country. We've talked to key media stakeholders, and together with two partner organizations, one West African and one Danish, we are now kickstarting sort of a review process, bringing in all key stakeholders in Gambian media to look at what does the sector need to go through the reform. What are the key priority areas? And that's bringing in a state broadcaster, the press union, the Ministry of Information, media outlets, and so on. So create an inclusive process that will sort of map out where the media needs to go in the coming years, and then we'll see if after that short-term initiative we can also be part of the longer term.
Let's do a last quick round here. What's your biggest wish, Roberta, from the media, what we should do in order to give alternative voices a platform?
Not just give focus and visibility to those groups, organizations that are driven and based on an ideological view of religion. DTIP for Germany is one, or other large institutions connected directly or indirectly to Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, or Salaf, even if Salafist groups are more visible. By doing so, the media reinforces their idea, their goal, that Muslims are just one. There's only one Muslim identity, and just by mentioning by mentioning Islam, you're offending the whole of Muslims. We need to, or the media needs to make that extra effort to understand the difference and give a voice to individuals of whether religious or more practicing or more secular, who are and define themselves as Muslims, but who have no doubts where it comes to the values, principles, fundamental institutions of liberal democracies.
Andreas and then Termina?
Well, basically, I think moving away from the sensationalist approach and do what media should do, analyze, challenge, question, bring out the nuances and so on. I think that's the role of the main role of the media when you talk about preventing radicalization and giving a voice to grievances, enabling debates, dialogues, and so on.
Thank you, Termina.
Mainstream media outlets could do a lot more to promote religious literacy, and a big part of this, in response to the previous gentleman's question, was the role of religious correspondence on the main newspapers in the UK. And for example, The Guardian had one from a Muslim background, a woman named Riyazat Butt. But then unfortunately in the cuts, I think that post was axed. And then the Times had a really good person in the form of Ruth Gledhill. She was their religious correspondent, and again, she did a wonderful job in terms of demystifying the debates on contemporary Islam and Muslims in the UK. But again, I think that post, I'm not sure if they have that post anymore. So I really wish that newspapers would restore their religious correspondent roles and do more to promote religious literacy.
Thank you very much. Lastly, from me, one idea also what news outlets can do, because EDF does that. We are supporting to develop material for schools, for educating young people in the discussion about terrorism and seeing the things behind terrorism, that this is a side effect of globalization, as Barack Obama once put it. And we, of course, have the means. We have the documentaries, we have the stories to tell, and we can give that material to schools and help teachers in order to facilitate that in the discussion and dialogue with young people. I'd like to thank you very much, Tamina, for being here, Roberta and Andreas, and thank you very much for you listening to us, and I wish you a great weekend, hopefully in Hamburg or wherever you go. Thank you.